afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Welcome to the 11th edition of our speaker series on women, peace, and security. On behalf of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, PeaceWomen Program, the Princeton University Liechtenstein Institute for Self-Determination, and the Mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Our goal for this lecture series is to strengthen a holistic approach to peace and security by informing key stakeholders about timely and cross-cutting issues in this field. With 2 Women, Peace, and Security resolutions that are new this year, and a new CEDAW general recommendation on women in conflict prevention, conflict, and post-conflict situations, it's a particularly good time for us to sit back and reflect on how we can all strengthen our efforts to continue to move the Women, Peace, and Security agenda forward. Today we will hear from UN Women's Chief Advisor on Peace and Security, Dr. Anne-Marie Goetz, who will speak on Women, Peace, and Security, looking ahead to 2015. Dr. Goetz will address opportunities and challenges for 2015 within the context of the new resolutions, Resolution 2106 and 2122, and the planned 2015 high-level review. She'll also provide some findings from the Expert Global Review on National and Regional Implementation, which was held November 5th through 7th. I'll only highlight a few parts of Dr. Goetz's extensive and impressive resume. Her work at the UN focuses, as many of you know, on supporting women's engagement in resolving conflict and engaging in public decision-making in conflict-affected countries. She's been a key ally and leader in pushing for a stronger women, peace, and security agenda. And this includes her critical efforts and support for recent Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, her work supporting the creation of UN action against sexual violence in conflict, as well as her work promoting economic opportunities and access to justice for women in post-conflict situations. Dr. Goetz has also built systems to strengthen accountability for UN Women, Peace, and Security resolutions through her work on a system of indicators and data to track progress on implementation. Before her work at the UN, she served as Professor of Political Science at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and is the author of 8 books on gender politics and accountability reforms. She'll be going on sabbatical this year, and we'll miss her vibrant and powerful presence. So we're particularly happy to have her during this time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I've been dying to get an invitation to come to this lecture series. I'm actually going to start by going through in a little bit of detail the review that UN Women conducted at the beginning of November on national implementation processes around 1325. And I'm going to wrap up with some reflections on where the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is going based on that review, and some sincere and serious concerns I have about the extent to which mainstreaming this agenda via national implementation is locking the Women, Peace, and Security agenda into certain unproductive aspects of a global agenda that is still not able effectively to stop war because of national interests. I'm going to, just to give you the quick highlights before I go into details on the National Action Plan Global Review meeting. There were 49 participants, all of them technical specialists in the implementation of national action plans from 25 member states and 3 regional organizations, the EU, NATO, and ASEAN. Just some of the highlights. The review itself demonstrated that there's a wide variety of strategies being used to translate these resolutions into national level actions as well as strategies, not just national action plans, but localization via local or regional, sub-regional governments, especially adoption into local development plans in contexts that don't have national action plans like Colombia. Mainstreaming women, peace, and security into other national planning instruments, such as PRSPs. Specific efforts to mainstream women, peace, and security into budget planning processes. And also, of course, the acknowledgement that a national action plan itself is not necessary. What's necessary is to be addressing security issues and the prevention of conflict. And this, of course, brings us to discussions of the post-2015 agenda, all of which I'll get into. It was noted that regional action plans are a good way to get accountability from the regional level to member states for national, or from member states for national engagement, and these should be used more. I think one of the most interesting things that came up was that those countries in which the National Action Plan involves a level of reporting to Parliament and bringing this issue into oppositional politics and debates in Parliament is a good thing and a way of sharpening national accountability. And there's a range of other points that I'll get to, but one of the most significant is that across the board, across the 43 national action plans that exist and the more or less 8 regional plans on women, peace, and security, there are gaps in 2 areas. There's serious gaps. One is around conflict prevention and engaging women in conflict prevention, and the second one is around women's participation in decision-making, particularly, of course, decision-making on the resolution of conflict. And that Resolution 2122 in the Council does give some teeth to the weak accountability that exists for 1325 and needs to be used more. Before I go on, I'd like to say that it's extremely interesting that this lecture series is organized by the Liechtenstein Center for Self-Determination, along with the PeaceWomen group, along with WILF. Because one of the issues that came up for me is the extent to which self-determination, if it's linked to nationalism and national projects, including national foreign policy, is inconsistent with the goals of women, peace, and security as originally established. So one of the things that's going to be very important for the way forward for women, peace, and security is delinking self-determination from nationalism. And I believe the post-2015 agenda offers a way of doing this. Now, that's all very arcane and abstract, so I will get to those points later on. First, the easy bit, the content of the global review. There were 4 themes. The first was developing national action plans. And something that came out very strongly is that it's extremely difficult to distinguish women, peace, and security from broader human security concerns. That issues such as women's access to justice in their everyday lives, women's experience of private violence, women's weakness in the marketplace and in politics can't be separated from the kind of more official, formal women, peace, and security agenda. One of the most important and constantly reiterated points is that national action planning around women, peace, and security must involve civil society. That both for legitimation and also for accountability, civil society groups must be involved and are strengthened in the process. Later on, I'm going to talk about the fetishization of planning and the focus on process rather than substance, which I think is a serious problem that we all share. But to the extent that process empowers women's civil society organizations, especially peace organizations, this is a valuable process. I'm going to go rather quickly through all this, but there was a strong call for, again, not saying that a country must have a national action plan, so there's no need to stand on and insist on this, but to align these plans with or make sure that they're expressed via other significant national planning processes depending on the country. It could be a national security policy. It certainly should be foreign policy to the extent that it's articulated. Certainly development plans, poverty reduction strategies, and so on. Existing reporting systems, as I mentioned, are valuable. Germany, I believe, pioneered the idea of reporting to parliamentary hearings, I think almost every other year. I'm not sure. Someone here surely can correct me. But this is done rather infrequently. We do not know of national action plan tracking or reporting that's done via an established parliamentary committee, such as a Defense Oversight Committee, a Security Sector Oversight Committee, and that would be an extremely valuable advance to have examples of that. International reporting systems will also strongly advance the effectiveness and the robustness of national action plans, and notably, of course, the CEDAW General Recommendation 30 passed on the very same day as the recent resolution 2122 in the Council, October 18th. Apparently there was some kind of stellar convergence that day to make this happen. But that, if you look at the very end of General Recommendation 30, it recommends that member states use existing international benchmarks and indicators to report on the implementation of 1325, which is a strong endorsement for adapting and using some of the international indicators, such as those that the Security Council asked to be taken forward in 2010, the 26 indicators on 1325. The second theme was approaches to implementation, and here, frankly, we really focused mainly on localization and a little bit on regionalization. And the reason for that was the strong role in the organization of this review of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, who must be here. I don't see Mavic, but there must be some representatives here, who have been focusing on localization processes in Nepal, Colombia, Philippines, Uganda, and Sierra Leone. And what this is about is translating 1325 into meaningful processes at the local level. And this has been extremely interesting in those contexts where the purpose of 1325 has been adapted across to local governments. So for example, in Sierra Leone, the focus has been on the prevention of gender-based and extreme sexual violence at local levels. For example, in the Philippines, there's been a strong focus on analyzing the gender spend of local government and looking at women's engagement in diffusing local disputes through local conflict resolution and mediation. I'm trying to think of other examples. In Colombia, it's very interesting because there's no national action plan, so it's not about adapting national frameworks and objectives to the local level. The third theme was accountability, monitoring, reviewing, and reporting. And of course, we all start from the point that 1325 has extremely weak accountability mechanisms. And the overall conclusion was that we need to strengthen accountability and monitoring through clear use of limited indicators, through use of the CEDAW reporting mechanism, of course, and a theme that I'll elaborate on in a moment, linking as strongly as possible to the post-2015 agenda, because there is going to be a lot of national progress in a number of areas related to human security and women, peace, and security that have to be addressed. Of course, there is a focus on sex and age disaggregated data, and especially addressing the issues of the variety of women's groups, especially the most vulnerable, depending on the context, and on qualitative data gathering. The difficulty with the international indicators on 1325 is that they're weak on prevention and they're focused on quantitative measurement. And there is a strong call for much better indicators on conflict prevention and use of these indicators in early warning mechanisms. Sorry, I just want to, all of this unfortunately is still under accountability and monitoring. A lot of these are pretty self-evident findings, and they will be coming up in the report from the meeting, and they're also in the background papers, so I don't want to go into too much detail. There was a strong call for the use of regional organizations to stimulate effective government action in reporting and monitoring. So no good examples were given of this, however. There were no examples of countries reporting their progress on implementing 1325 to regional organizations, or regional organizations urging any kind of regional reflection on progress in a systematic way. CSO monitoring, of course, including shadow monitoring, is very important, and again, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders has developed their own parallel set of indicators, much more qualitative than the international ones, for monitoring national implementation. And strengthening these processes is valuable because you get an alternative voice. Okay, I'm skipping over some of the more obvious points. On financing, there were no really good examples of any particular country strongly earmarking financing for national action plans or tracking it. There is still enormous confusion on how to cost national action plans and how to analyze gender marker 2, That's the UN parlance. We have a 4-point gender marker from 0 to 3. Gender marker 2 is supposed to measure gender mainstreaming. Just as a kind of point of information on the UN's own processes, UN Women and UNDP recently supported a study of 6 post-conflict countries looking at the gender marker. And we analyzed what project managers had indicated to be a gender marker 3 project, which means fully supporting gender equality and women's empowerment. And then we went through every single project that was marked that way. And our assessment was that rather than the 6%, which the UN said was being spent on gender marker 3, we found it was closer to 1%. And there's enormous confusion on gender marker 2. That means full gender mainstreaming. Some project managers say, well, a road with a sidewalk that women can walk on is a gender mainstreamed project. Others say, no, you need to count the number of beneficiaries. So a school with latrines and teachers that encourage girls latrines and women teachers that have 50% girl students, that's gender marker 2. That's full gender mainstreaming. So there's enormous subjectivity and variation in how we count the gender spend. Obviously, there's a need to fund prevention and reaction to emergencies. In the case right now of the Philippines, of course, this is a natural disaster, not a conflict-related disaster, but one would ask, is there any kind of provision for dealing with emergencies? Not just, by the way, funding is important for dealing with emergencies and emergency reactions, but there were no national action plans that we could find that contained provisions for actual conflict breaking out. So in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, they had a stellar national action plan prior to the electoral violence that tore up the country, which had no impact whatsoever on reactions to the conflict when it actually came. Now, there's a lot of focus on foreign funding for national action plans, but that, of course, undermines national commitment and ownership, and the idea that the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the Interior, Ministry of Justice should be contributing their own spending, their own financing to the implementation of these funds. So that was a very important point, and there were some countries that actually had achieved allocations from these ministries for implementation. There was a strong encouragement for the development of multi-stakeholder financing mechanisms for national action plans, and indeed the idea, among many recommendations for UN Women, that UN Women should host an international donor conference for the funding of national action plans. I am not actually going to share with you the full list of recommendations to UN Women because we have to digest this first, and there was an extraordinary list. Okay, so I'm going to now get on to the broader reflections that this whole process triggered. The first one, as I mentioned before, is that there's a real problem and a risk that we're fetishizing planning processes. And it's not just national action plans, but even within the UN, the 7-point plan and the strategic results framework and so on. And we're doing this at the expense of actually focusing on results. We've seen this inside the UN, and we certainly have seen this in national processes, where there's a fetishization of this process and very little discussion of substance. Now, here comes the autocritique from the UN. We organized this reflection and this review, but the UN is remarkably reticent about talking about substance and content. So in all the background papers, you will not find an analysis of the content of national action plans. You will not find that. You will seriously not find it. I had to unpick that myself from what I heard. And what I heard were generalizations that you're all very familiar with. Donor country action plans, rich country action plans tend to focus externally. We don't have an internal problem of conflict. We have an external problem. They focus mainly on the implementation of foreign policy, and at best, at feminizing domestic foreign policy and security establishments. So at getting more women into all ranks in the foreign affairs ministry and into the military and into the police. But I do not know of, and I hope you will correct me, of any national action plans of a donor country or a wealthy country that focuses on internal conflict and causes of internal conflict, or on gross inequities between social groups that are experienced most acutely by women. On the other hand, conflict-affected countries focus primarily, almost exclusively, internally, not on their exercise of foreign policy, not on strategies for how they deal with the international community and their role within international and regional institutions, but mainly on internal processes. So in Uganda, for example, there was a strong focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is not surprising because UNFPA strongly sponsored the development of the action plan there. This, by the way, was a component that was largely lacking from many other national action plans, a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is something that's extremely important, of course, for women's self-respect, dignity, health, and empowerment. In Nepal, there was a strong focus on police and army training, the issues of the large number of widows created by the conflict, and the issue of reparations. And Nepal has an extraordinary experience with its peace fund, both its national peace fund, which is internationally funded, and its UN peace fund, which is very small, both of which have strong gender components, particularly the UN peace fund. And in the Philippines, as I mentioned before, there is a strong focus on local mediation and conflict resolution and bringing conflict analysis into local government planning. But beyond this, it was really hard to get a strong comparative perspective on content. So my own kind of readout from the global review is that it would be great if a research institution could actually look into the substantive content of these action plans. Not just the process, which is was entirely our focus in the global review, but the content and the value of that content and how it affects the actions of states at the international and regional level, how it affects their engagement in international peacemaking or not. So that would be a very serious kind of conclusion that I would bring out. There were very sobering political contradictions that were not addressed. What does it mean that many countries have national action plans and yet engage in militaristic adventures? What does it mean that there are belligerent and aggressive foreign policies being being employed by some countries with national action plans? Do we see women in those countries seriously engaging in trying to prevent conflict, promote disarmament, and promote demilitarization, or at least a more realistic public management of national spending? Not realistic, a more humane public management of national spending on the military. I haven't seen a national action plan that does this. And if we think about the purpose of 1325, it very strongly promotes the idea of disarmament, demilitarization, and peacemaking. What does it mean to have a national action plan in countries that have returned to conflict, like Côte d'Ivoire, and not seen their national action plans activated in any way? I would say that in the Côte d'Ivoire context, regrettably, the national action plan, fair enough, it was formulated and finalized quite close in time to the resumption of conflict, to the electoral violence. But did that change national or local perceptions and perspectives on women's security in any way? And that is a country, let's remember, that has been, in which it's been very difficult for women to talk about the extent of sexual violence that they experienced in the severe conflict that it's just been through. So I mean, these are very important considerations. If we're thinking about national action plans as a serious recommendation to countries, we should be asking ourselves, in what way do they seriously enable systems to be set up for protection and so on? My own conclusions from the meeting were that in order seriously to advance the women, peace, and security agenda via national action plans, they need to include, at a minimum, these 5 components. And this probably refers more to countries in conflict but not exclusively, or recently emerging from conflict but not exclusively. First of all, it's crucial that we get away from the singular focus on sexual violence as the main violation that women experience or are likely to experience in conflict. This has become the overwhelming focus, as we know, of international and regional approaches. Why? Because it's a gender crime that has indeed been neglected shamefully in the past. But it's an international violation. It's something that fits neatly into international frameworks for prosecution. Now, first of all, there's an awful lot of other gender-specific crimes that fit into those frameworks for prosecution that are being neglected. But secondly, and much more important, there is a connection between the private violence that women experience and this public violence. And that connection is denied in current peace and security frameworks to the detriment of seriously addressing the causes of widespread sexual violence. So in terms of the first point, the other types of violations that women experience, attacks on women human rights defenders, attacks on women journalists, attacks designed to intimidate girls from going to school and stop them from going to school, as in Afghanistan, acid throwings, general intimidation, and so on. These are serious crimes that are associated with conflict. But in addition, women experience common human rights violations differently from men. They do experience displacement differently from men. And while displaced, they have fewer resources to address and deal with displacement. And that, of course, by the way, is one of the many normative advances that we see in Resolution 2122. The fact that it's recognized that women's prior weak citizenship rights undermine their capacity to deal with displacement is a crucial finding, and means that we have to address their prior weak citizenship rights. So national action plans should be seeking to strengthen women's citizenship rights around the world, so that they have an ID card with them when they flee, so that they have a property title to recover when they return, if and when they return, so that they have a sense of personhood and dignity, and so that they can transfer their nationality to any children born in exile, which often they can't, so that they can make claims on a particular state. Beyond that, I said that none of these kinds of crimes are being addressed. I was also saying there's gender-specific experiences of other violations. Mass starvation is experienced differently by women because of their different physiognomy. Deprivation of access to your children is experienced differently by women. There are a range of concerns that are experienced differently by gender. Secondly, as I said, there are the connection between private and public violence has to be addressed. And there is a need actually for some analytical work on the distinction between the 4 Security Council resolutions on sexual violence and the 3 on women's participation. So you're very familiar with this, everyone in here I know. The 4 on sexual violence, 1820, 1888, 1960, and 2106, are notable because their signature is in paragraph 7, I think, of 1820, or maybe it's 4, which says that sexual violence is a tactic of warfare. As a tactic of warfare, it merits a security and political response. A security response, meaning peacekeepers must be deployed in such a way as to detect and prevent imminent sexual violence attacks. That requires a completely different approach, as we know, to preparedness, training, even equipment. Peacekeepers may need night vision goggles in the jungles and forests of East Congo rather than a security blockade for the main road at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Sexual violence happens at night when women are coming home from the fields, between 4 and 6 a.m. when women are collecting water. Peacekeepers need to deploy physically differently in time and space in order to address this problem. That's a different security response. Plus, of course, you need more women peacekeepers to provide an entry point and access point to women in the population, and better translators, or more of them. But secondly, as a political response, and this is something, of course, that is found in OP3 of 1820, OP3 of 1888, and throughout 2106, and of course was then translated into guidance notes by DPA for mediators. As a political issue, this has to be taken up in all levels of peacemaking. Sexual violence is an obstacle to peacemaking. Mediators must address it. It must come into ceasefire arrangements. It must come into the discussion about peace arrangements and peace talks. So that's all been extremely important. Sexual violence is a tactic of warfare requiring a security and political response. Remember, prior to 1820, sexual violence even in 2007, was described by the Security Council, by members of the Security Council, who I heard with my own ears, as collateral damage and shame. Boys will be boys. Now, there's a huge difference between 2007, boys will be boys, and 2008, this is a tactic of warfare. It's an enormously significant development, without any question. But it contains a very serious problem. It means that sexual violence is described within the law of war, international humanitarian law. That is the big difference from the past. By describing it as a tactic of warfare, sexual violence is described as a matter of the laws of war and what constitutes fair fighting. To do this separates it from, and all of the recommended responses, separates it from the issue of gender-based inequality. It becomes something that is either commanded or condoned, and its connection to broad social gender inequality is severed. And this is a serious problem, and indeed there have been explicit statements by a number of international actors. One, to quote a general involved in Eastern Congo, said sexual violence is not a woman's issue, it is a warfare issue. That's not the exact quote, but something like that. This was extremely important to get the Security Council to treat it seriously, but it did mean surrendering part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda to lock this into an international humanitarian law agenda, Geneva Conventions. This is not fair fighting. And this, unfortunately, as I said, separates it from a consideration of the prevalence and tolerance for gender-based violence in all of our societies at all times, whether during war and peace. The work by, of course, Valerie Hudson in her extremely important ovular book, Sex and World Peace, illustrates with quantitative data that there is a connection between social acceptance and tolerance for gender-based violence. There's a connection between high levels of domestic violence and so on, and inability of societies to resolve conflicts nonviolently. So she shows that as societies manage to diminish the amount of tolerance for domestic violence, marital rape, and so on, they engage less and less in violent resolution of internal and external disputes. So that whole important element of the Women, Peace and Security agenda went by the wayside. So the first point is that to seriously address national implementation of Women, Peace and Security, it's extremely difficult to separate it from the broader issues of gender inequality and violence against women. Secondly, as I noted before, this issue of addressing gender and women's security as part of prevention efforts, conflict prevention, and engaging women in conflict prevention, and I'll come on to recovery in a moment. So it was noted that there's very little said about conflict prevention in national action plans. Now, for many here, that's not a surprise because it's a big mystery as to what constitutes conflict prevention. Peace education has been tried in in many societies and doesn't necessarily prevent conflict. What is conflict prevention? And in this regard, I think that some of the most useful thinking on this has actually been done by Navi Pillay, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, who has argued consistently that if we want to address the post-2015 agenda realistically, we have got to bring in conflict prevention and specifically the need of all peoples for self-determination and democratic participation. She's written an extraordinary paper in 2011 on the fact that Tunisia, just before the Arab Spring, performed beautifully on the MDGs and ranked high on the MDGs. No one would have predicted the beginning of the spark that lit the Arab Spring, that it would happen there. But what she notes is that while everyone else could see good performance on the MDGs, what they couldn't see was a sense of social exclusion, of a lack of respect, a lack of human dignity. And that true conflict prevention comes with genuinely approaching self-determination in an inclusive way, but, and this she doesn't go into this, trying to delink it from nationalism, which is something I'm going to come on to in a little while. Secondly, something that's very striking about national action plans is fairness in the distribution of the peace dividend. And this is something, again, that I've said in many other contexts is a scandal, an international scandal, that when we look at a post-conflict situation and we're looking at the distribution of the peace dividend, what we're looking at is immediately DDR, get the spoilers out of trouble, make sure they have a hoe and a couple of seeds and an agricultural loan, make sure they have a job, get them a Honda, whatever. Get the spoilers off the streets, get the spoilers out of trouble. That usually means male ex-combatants. Where is the distribution of the peace dividend for the victims? And I don't just mean women, but the victims of conflict. Why don't we look at the distribution of the peace dividend for the victims? And this is a huge gap area internationally. No one's done an analysis of the disparity in funding, but it's something that would be a valuable exercise, again, for that mythical and perfect research institution that's in this room. Maybe it's the Princeton Center for Self-Determination, I'm not sure. But this would be a valuable exercise in terms of justice and prosecutions and rulings that address crimes that women have experienced post-conflict, and in terms of the distribution of resources and opportunities post-conflict. We know that this is desperately skewed and imbalanced, and this is particularly chronic and unfair given that we know that in any post-conflict context, up to 40% of households are female-headed. And in some even more. Apparently in Mozambique after the conflict it was 60% of households, which is just astronomical. You all are development specialists. You know that female-headed households are associated with poverty. You also probably know that during conflict, female-headed households expand and they become much bigger than male-headed households. They take on orphans. They take on elderly people. So they have an enhanced burden of dependence, and yet what opportunities do they have for income generation? Again, bizarrely, we know very little about this. But we do know that in African context, post-conflict context, women may not recover in many places their husband's property, including their own house and their husband's land, because that goes back to his family. So what is the female-headed household supposed to do to survive? What a surprise that the sexualization of economies follows on the heels of conflict without any investment in the livelihoods of women. So you have highly sexualized economies, and we've seen in the Indochina region the impact that's had on women's rights and on violence against women. So I would be very interested to see a national action plan that focuses on equality in the distribution of peace dividends like justice, jobs, and social services. Third, there's a need to focus on, in all economies without exception, on increasing women's rate of market and political engagement of all kinds. And that's linked to the fourth point of strengthening women's organizations. So whether it's in the US or Uganda, whether it's in Norway or Nepal, the issue of women's significant market engagement is really inseparable from long-term conflict prevention. There is research now to show that where women are 30% of the labor market, countries simply do not go to war. And the research on women's participation in politics is also fairly compelling in that regard, but just a little bit less so because, of course, in many countries now, quotas can be used and do not necessarily reflect, the number of women does not necessarily reflect the level of democracy in the system or the level of inclusiveness. Because in many cases, and again, this is a problem I'm going to get onto, women are engaging in political life, maybe not necessarily as a process of interest advancement, advancing women's interests, or any particular political interest, but rather as a tool to shore up the legitimation of a political leader. And to the extent that that happens, this is not a good thing. It doesn't mean that women are exercising political judgment or advancing interests of a particular group, except the leader. The fourth area, women's organizations need significant capacity building. Again, there is so little data on this, it's astounding. But we don't know very much about the strength of women's organizations in conflict situations and post-conflict situations, except that we do know that women often organize to stop war and to join protest movements, as all across the Western Balkans, the women in black were a very significant pacifist presence throughout the conflict, also in Ireland. But the problem, of course, is if you are going to build an organization, you need management capability. If you're going to get funding, you need financial management and audit capability. And frankly, good organizations need paying members. There's no way around this, I'm afraid. You need paying members who feel that the organization owes them something, but also who can be called on to come out on the streets and protest. And a lot of women's organizations don't function that way. In fact, Joe Friedman years ago wrote about the tyranny of structurelessness, that women's organizations despise structure because of their negative experiences of formal organization, and therefore structureless organizations are a very feel-good approach to organizing, but not a very effective way to calling the people on the streets when you need them. The other thing about a paid-up membership is that it creates a vibrant, valuable constituency that will vote for you after the protest is over. And this is one of the striking things, of course, about the Arab Spring. Women were on the streets, women's organizations were very active, but they did not take a place in politics afterwards. They didn't have the structured constituency of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in Egypt. And this is a big problem for all of us here, and I think especially for UN Women, because we are nothing if women's organizations are not strong, especially in fragile states. We are truly nothing, because it means that our agenda will be seen as a moralistic form of humanitarian crusading. And this is so damaging and so dangerous to the women's rights agenda, to be seen as an external humanitarian crusade rather than a sui generis political movement coming from within. We have no doubt that women's organizations exist everywhere, and women's movements strive for freedom, respect for human rights, and for equality. Unfortunately, in today's political environment, including at the UN, where you have debates in the Women and Development Resolution on the meaning of unpaid care work and whether it merits inclusion in a Women and Development Resolution, for heaven's sake, what we're seeing is a backlash against women's rights and a frequent reference to culture. Our culture, women are happy in our culture. They accept these restrictions on their rights. And the UN Women answer to that is, can we hear from women themselves? Do they have the opportunity to tell us how they feel? Do they have the opportunity to formulate interests without fear and repression? If they still say they accept a violation of women's rights, well then, prove me wrong. But in most cases, given the opportunity for reflection using Habermasian principles of justice and equality and security, women would not necessarily, in fact in our experience, would always opt for respect for their rights. So we need to find ways of supporting women's organizations to build constituencies. And in that regard, I'd like to applaud and recognize the Dutch initiative to set up a fund to support women's organizations in the Middle East and North Africa region. The purpose of the fund, which is called Women on the Front Lines, and you can look it up, is simply to support financial sustainability of women's organizations. The fund is implemented by HIVOS in partnership with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and its sole purpose is to enable women's organizations to hire a financial manager, get some computers, and survive an audit after 1 year. If you can survive an audit after 1 year, you can apply for big money. That is the sole purpose of this fund, to enable women's organizations to function on the same level and playing field as other human rights organizations. Finally, gender-sensitive approaches to governance reforms. It's absolutely striking in especially fragile state contexts that governance reforms are approached as if they were irrelevant to gender equality. And this is astonishing because every aspect of the management of public life is gender specific. And without bringing gender more centrally into governance reforms and the meaning of good governance, we're not going to be seeing the kinds of the sort of previous lists that I've articulated of public policies that advance women's rights, get them into the market, encourage political participation, and so on. And one of the simplest, lowest cost approaches to reasserting decent, responsive governance is not even under discussion, and we have proposed it as actually an indicator for the post-2015 agenda, and that is the employment of women to deliver public services. The employment of women at the front line of public services, and no, not just health and education, not just nurses and doctors and teachers, but people delivering business support services, people enabling women and men to register for identity cards and other documents, business licenses in local government offices, agricultural extension workers, etc. This is simply not a post-conflict priority. In fact, those jobs are seen as the property of men, once again, as part of the distribution of the peace dividend. We have research from around the world that's showing if you have more women in these frontline positions, you have a more poverty-sensitive public service. Why? All kinds of reasons, none of them tested. Some have to do with the relative newness of women to public service, which means that they spend less time doing dirty deals in dark rooms, organizing for corruption, and more time trying to do their job and get accepted and get promoted. And there is some evidence for that, especially from places like India and Brazil. But there's also the fact that there is a basic understanding that women public service providers, if they're not in an awful token minority, do tend to respond to the needs of women and girl clients a little bit better. And around the issue of policing and security, there's evidence from around the world that the more women you have at the front desk of a police station, the levels of reporting of sexual violence shoot up. And that is reporting by men as well as women, girls as well as boys. Men and boys will come and talk to the police if they can talk to a woman about sexual violence. 2015, and I'm out of time. I didn't even see that. It flapped it at me. Oh my God. Okay. I'm sorry. What time do you end? All right, I'll be very quick. According to the World Bank, 1.5 billion people were in countries affected by fragility or conflict in 2011. That amount has gone up. 82% of the world's poor are going to live in fragile states by 2025. And given the way poverty figures work, the majority of that 82% are going to be women and girls. So the issue of bringing gender and conflict concerns to the 2015 agenda are absolutely crucial. The high-level panel report was a wonderful beginning for this. Concepts of dignity, self-determination, democracy, and conflict prevention were figured prominently in the findings of the high-level panel report. And among the 5 transformative shifts that are needed for the immediate future, the high-level panel said, peace and good governance are core elements for well-being, not an optional extra. So I have no time, I'm out of time, but we do actually have a draft paper where we've gone through the basic arguments for bringing gender and conflict issues into the post-2015 agenda. And among the indicators that we've listed are things like numbers of women who lead civil society organizations, proportion of civil society, proportion of women who are members of civil society organizations, as well as this issue of women employed at the front line of public services. Because I'm so out of time, I'm going to rush, but without any question, 2122 and the General Recommendation 30, CEDAW General Recommendation 30, have provided important resources for readying for 2015. There is a strong endorsement in both of these tools, in both of these normative advances, for stronger efforts to engage women in decision-making and conflict resolution, and in stronger reporting on efforts to do this. And of course, 2122 calls explicitly for the production of a global study on the implementation of Resolution 1325 and related resolutions to enable the discussions in 2015 to be better informed by a stronger evidence base. This would be an opportunity, for example, to look at the substantive content of national action plans and to ask ourselves whether that content meets the objectives of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the first place. Now, let me just finish with some disturbing reflections, and I've made these reflections mainly because I know that PeaceWomen and the Self-Determination Center are running this lecture series. But it seems to me that implementation of 1325, we have to go back to its core principles of justice and self-determination and participation for women and accountability. Now, all of the UN human rights frameworks have weak accountability processes. They would never be agreed to by all the countries in the world if they had strong accountability processes, and that's just a matter of fact. But we do need to be careful that, as has happened in the case of the sexual violence agenda, we have to be careful that we don't end up legitimizing approaches to conflict and conflict management that don't contain the core elements of 1325, which frankly are embedded in an almost 100-year history of pacifism, of women's commitment to disarmament, demilitarization, and pacifism, and nonviolent approaches to conflict. Now, the UN is not a pacifist institution. That's not the way it was set up. It was set up for the management of conflict and ideally the prevention of conflict. But that is the genius of 1325 and the fact that it came into the Council. It contains an element which is committed to absolute nonviolent resolution of conflict. And for the record, I would like to apologize to Sam Cooke, who was one of your predecessors at PeaceWomen, because I was skeptical. I wasn't a pacifist when I joined the UN. I am a total pacifist now, after 8.5 years. And at one stage, I entered into a horrible argument with her where I really criticized pacifism because it's not realistic. But the fact is, logically, it is the only solution. And logically, it has to be brought into, much more strongly, the work that we do. So we welcome the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, but so much more has to be done on disarmament, demobilization, and demilitarization. National action plans cannot involve the Women, Peace and Security agenda in legitimizing any kind of foreign policies that are warlike. And that is a real concern and a contradiction that is inherent in some national action plans. So, I hope this is my last slide, yes. Let me just say that one of the core problems that we address at the UN, of course, is that we're limited by national sovereignty. And national sovereignty comes with a concept of self-determination that is tied to nationalism. Is it possible for us to look at self-determination in a non-nationalistic way? Because we do not know of any nationalisms that are not tied to gender power stories and to restrictions on female sexuality or its control for the nation. So the concept of citizenship being grounded in what you're either a soldier or a mother, we have to move beyond that. And that was the genius of 1325, moving beyond the fact that you're either a soldier or a mother to be a citizen. We have to move beyond these two notions and look at citizenship as being about respect for the person. And I know that's a very kind of abstract point to end on, but I think I've made you tolerate too much lecturing, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for that incredibly refreshing and thought-provoking lecture. I have to say, so often in our conversations about 1325, we see pictures, or I tend to see pictures. I was just in Kazakhstan last week, and there's all these amazing pictures of women wearing military uniforms. And in this case, there were women who were wearing high heels and short skirts military uniforms. Mm-hmm. And so often, I think that 1325 does get diluted, and it becomes an add women to the military institution, rather than what it was intended originally as being, as against war. And WILPF has, as you noted, been a pacifist organization where for peace through disarmament and women's full and equal rights, and we have been for the last 100 years. And on PeaceWomen's Women, Peace and Security portal, one of the things that we point out is that NAPs usually don't address demilitarization and disarmament. And for example, of the top arms producers with national action plans, the US, the UK, and France, none of them address arms exports. And so we really welcome your suggestions that this kind of really substance focus gets taken up. And we also, I just wanted to flag that our next edition of our iPhone app, which addresses NAPs and commitments, including indicators, is coming out in December. So you can use that. Please use that in your advocacy. And I guess I just want to ask a couple of questions and then open it up to a brief round of questions. Maybe we can take them all at once since we don't have so many minutes. But I just wanted to ask you, once we take a few more questions, to say a little bit more about how you see post-2015 and the sustainable development discussions as an opportunity to move forward and move delinking nationalism in 1325. Because while I very much welcome Resolution 2122's affirmation of the need for an integrated approach linking development, security, conflict, and human rights. The discussion on the post-2015 and sustainable development side has been notably absent of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and primarily, in my understanding, frames women as victims rather than agents, and is taking very much an incremental approach. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we can build on that a little more effectively, and also in terms of mapping the landscape, how can we take 2015, which is such a good opportunity, given that it's the 15-year anniversary of 1325, the MDGs, the 20-year anniversary of Beijing, to move beyond another round of commitments. How do we move to action? So those are my questions, but maybe I can take a couple more since we probably won't have too many rounds. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Anne-Marie over here? Maybe we can take maybe 4 total.
And thank you very much. My name is Maysa. I'm from the Saudi Arabian Mission to the United Nations. It's more of a clarification on a comment that you put forth about delinking self-determination from nationalism, and you were saying you were going to come back to that and explain a little bit, so I would appreciate it if you could do that for us. Thank you.
Any other questions? Right over here.
Yeah, I represent the NGO Mediators Beyond Borders International.
What Beyond Borders?
Mediators.
Mediators, okay, great.
Mediators Beyond Borders International. And we have a member that's actually working with the Supreme Court in Nepal. And you had mentioned conflict resolution development on the local and or regional level. I'm wondering if you could tell me more about that maybe after this presentation, because it would be helpful for our organization to find out what the what aspect of conflict resolution on a regional level or local level you're referring to. We may already be linked up with it, but if not, it'd be great helpful to know.
So I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
The Mediators Beyond Borders International. We have a member who works with the Supreme Court regarding conflict resolution in Nepal. And I think you had mentioned that there's a regional or local development in conflict resolution in Nepal. And I'm just wondering, just in case this particular member is not familiar with it, if you could find out or let me know what that organization is, how that works. Thank you.
Sarah Taylor from the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. Sorry about the voice. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for a wonderful and thought-provoking discussion. I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit more about how we get to the progressive part of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in a very practical way. I think we're familiar with the challenge of trying to do the work from an international and multilateral perspective, as you point out, the very real institutional challenges of trying to do that work with the Council. And I think that it's very interesting the way that you point out some of the challenges of trying to do that at the national level. So how do we do that? If you could speak a little bit more about some of the ways that we can do that from a very progressive, feminist way, but practically, like how do we do that? What are your recommendations? Be provocative.
Okay. Please let me confess that I have as many questions as you do about how to practically approach the breadth of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. But just as a way of addressing the question about self-determination without nationalism and this practical issue, to start with, there is a problem. No, this is separate from self-determination. I'll come to that. I'm going to do Sarah's question first. There is a real problem with the institutional silos within which we work when it comes to peace and security, and we all know this. And we've all adapted to the Security Council's framework very carefully so that we get serious attention. And yet the consequences, I think, are rather negative. If you cannot engage all parts of the UN, for example, in promoting human rights and in stopping violence against women wherever it happens. So the idea that a peacekeeper is only responsible for stopping public violence, for instance, is a problem, because it means that I mean, yes, a peacekeeper can't do everything. A peacekeeper can't keep peace between men and women at home. But we're leaving out the huge amount of conflict that happens between the genders. And we have to try to address that. So I actually don't have a very good answer for you, but one thing that we have to do, and it's extremely important, is the Women, Peace and Security agenda has to be addressed very seriously by the General Assembly and ECOSOC, Human Rights Council. It has been taken on board by the PBC, and that's a great thing, but we have to bring it into these other institutions without letting the Security Council off the hook for addressing it, and that is a big difficulty, without a doubt. But at the moment, because of these silos, countries don't want to admit that they have conflict. They don't want to acknowledge the extent of internal conflict because of a great fear, as we know, that they'll go on the Council's agenda with all the dreadful things that happen as a result. Now, this is a very negative approach, and it means that there are even countries that are saying that they won't produce national action plans or address their responsibilities to implement 1325 nationally because they have no conflict, because they don't experience conflict. And this is kind of a reaction to and a reinforcement of these silos. So the first thing I think is we've got to find a way of getting this addressed by the GA. And I think a lot of progress has been made actually in recent years. So the GA's resolution of 2012 on mediation has strong gender content, for example, which is a very progressive development. But this has to come into GA discussions on violence against women as well, for instance. Now, in terms of self-determination and nationalism, this is a really challenging issue because political communities are a legitimate and moral way for people to organize. And the fact that they are linked almost always to ethnic identities or language use has become highly problematic because these identities are always or almost always linked to restrictive scripts for both men and women on their relations with each other and their role within the nation. The soldier and mother idea that Theda Skocpol wrote about, for example, as a basis for US citizenship. So how do you get away from that? I'm not sure, but there is striking scholarship coming out of the Western Balkans, for example, which has experienced this connection between ethnicity and self-determination, and which of course drove the structure of the Dayton Agreement. WILPF is engaged, I hope it's not a secret, with the Syrian women's organizations, and bringing Syrian women's groups together with Bosnian women's groups to talk about how damaging ethno-nationalist approaches to constitutional development and post-conflict frameworks are. So, it's not like it's an easy thing, no question about it. People naturally form into ethnic or linguistic groupings. But to the extent to which that's tied to restrictive gender scripts and not linked to true equality and true participation of all citizens is a major problem. And that isn't just a problem that affects women, but it affects indigenous groups, ethnic minorities, etc. And it's very difficult to think about solutions to that. One thing I haven't even mentioned, of course, is the issue of the way national sovereignty affects how we deal with other bigger problems that link us, of course, such as ecological problems, climate change, and so on, or planetary boundaries. And there's a philosopher called Omar I forget his last name, Omar Dabur, who's just written a book called Self-Determination Without Nationalism, who develops this idea that we have to actually focus on ecological communities, or what he calls eco-sovereignty, to address some of these problems of deep human inequalities. I don't have an answer, but I do think the post-2015 framework may provide some entry points for addressing some of this. For example, there's a big challenge with the post-2015 framework. There's a lot of resistance to including conflict within it, because conflict means that you might not have a universal framework, that there might be some specific focus on, those countries that are going to be, in 2015, that are going to have 82% of the world's poor. And this is not acceptable to the international community, quite rightly. But the gender angle does provide an opening to regarding conflict as a universal thing, to the extent that gender-based discrimination is linked so strongly to conflict and to the propensities of societies to engage in violent solutions. That actually is a good justification for investing globally in gender equality as a means of reducing conflict globally. And that would include specifically promoting more women in foreign policy. And frankly, yes, if you're going to have a military, more women in the military, definitely more women in the police. To looking at gender-specific approaches to the control of small arms to make sure that they don't get into the hands of, within communities or violent individuals and so on. So it may provide a constructive angle to bringing, conflict issues into the post-2015 framework. The issue that you raised, Abigail, about bringing conflict again into the 2015 framework and looking at women not as victims as they are currently looked at, but agents. Once again, I think there's an awful lot of positive approaches to this. I mentioned some of them, but tracking the numbers of women in foreign policy, tracking the numbers of women at the front line of public service delivery in all countries, and especially security services, numbers of women in politics, and of course equal employment are important. But at UN Women, as you all know, we developed a standalone gender goal. And we wanted it also to look at things that aren't going to be addressed in other frameworks. Unpaid labor and the distribution of unpaid labor, tracking the extent to which men engage in care work, for example, as a positive international goal. Tracking of, obviously, violence against women at home, marital rape and domestic violence. These are things that nobody else is going to track, and yet we're convinced that these would be contributions to peace, domestically, in the nation, and in the world.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, Anne-Marie, I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I think it really clearly highlights, for me at least, the need for an integrated approach to peace and security, which is something that WILP's been pushing for almost 100 years, but we're not there yet, so we need to keep pushing more. I think that engaging strategically at this point in time, especially given 2015, provides all these different avenues of engagement is really critical. I think you've raised a lot of really excellent questions, which we don't know all of the answers to, but I hope that all of us really keep trying and moving this forward. So I want to thank you for being here, for taking the time and really putting so much thought and effort into this, and for all of your work, for the PeaceWomen interns, for our wonderful co-partners on this project, and to all of you for being here and for listening and for taking it away with you and for asking your questions. So thanks, and have a great afternoon.